Is that his beard, or nose hair? Donghai, Rog Town, on the square in front of the city hall, a girl with sunglasses wearing a black leather coat and a raincoat outside, looked at the brawny man who was about to be executed on the high platform. Next to the girl, there is a woman. Compared with the girl, she is much more mature. After hearing the girl's words, blue veins appeared on the woman's face. In the crowd, a red-haired boy wearing a straw hat, his eyes full of tears, looked at the girl who just spoke, as if to remember this girl who looked the same age as him. The girl was indifferent, but the woman felt the gaze cast from her surroundings, and the woman blocked the girl's mouth. "Follow me. If you stay here, I'm afraid you will be the one to be executed first." He held the girl's head with his arms, dragged her away, and leaned on the pillow on the woman's chest. The girl didn't resist, and her eyes under the sunglasses even narrowed slightly. Along the way, the earring on the woman's right ear seemed to interfere with the girl's sight, and it seemed that there were other reasons that caused her eyebrows to wrinkle tightly. The woman didn't stop until she reached an unoccupied attic. There were few people here, but the sight was not as good as before, so she let go of the girl. The girl picked up her t-shirt, wiped the corner of her mouth, and then said to the woman in dissatisfaction, "Vorgonas, how long has it been since you took a bath? Even your hands stink." The woman, who was called Vanas, with blue veins jumping on her forehead, raised her right hand, pinched the girl's cheek, forcing the girl to open her mouth, and then her left hand turned into quicksand, poured into the girl's mouth, and shouted, "Road, damn Skyla, you don't know how to keep your mouth shut, do you?" Voganas was obviously very dissatisfied with the girl. After one round of torture, she pulled out the quicksand and turned it into an arm again. Voganas looked at the saliva on her hand with disgust. The girl Skyla squatted on the spot, retching, and said, "It seems that you are not only stinky on your skin, but also stinky anywhere on your body." "Humph." The woman looked at the execution platform in the distance and said, "Are you still watching? The execution is about to begin." "I really don't understand. A girl who is inspired to become a navy actually asks me, a big pirate, to bring you here." Hearing this, Skyla got up and leaned behind Vorgonas. Because the window in the attic was very small, Vorgonas alone took up all the space. Skyla could only rely on her, with her head and shoulders. The missing corner between, looking into the distance. "What are you holding against me?" Vorgonas frowned, and while speaking, she stretched out her hand and swept behind her. She touched a hard, round stick-like thing. Suddenly, Vorgonas said to the girl behind her in dissatisfaction, "Skyla, take back your sword." Okay. When I squatted down, I twisted my King Kong dot," Skyla said, and moved his blade box King Kong from his left waist back to his waist, and the two long swords on the blade box, one long and one short, no longer pressed against Vorgonas' thigh. Vorgonas took out a cigar from the four-dimensional pocket on her chest, thought about it, took out another, and handed it to Skyla, looking at One Piece Luo who was about to be executed in the distance. Jay said, "I really don't understand. It's such a serious scene, but you have to wear a raincoat. Are you joking? Well, fire." While speaking, Vons lit a cigar and handed a box of matches to the girl. The girl stood on tiptoe and looked at Roger in the distance, as if she didn't want to step back to light a cigarette, so she held it dry. "Cigar," said, "because it will rain. Also, you stinky woman, even OP stinky." Vorgonas looked at the high-hanging sunlight, shrugged noncommittally, and stuffed the match into the four-dimensional pocket on her chest. At this time, the two navies responsible for the execution had already begun the execution ceremony. First, he turned the long-handled Naginata sword in his hand, and then put it on Roger's neck. The man who was called One Piece and who completed the voyage of the Great Waterway remained motionless, and there was silence below. "Roger! You became the Pirate King, what about your treasure?" Suddenly, in the crowd below, one person couldn't help but shouted to Roger on the execution platform. Roger, who was silent and expressionless, heard the words, and suddenly a smile appeared on his face. It seemed that it's the scene he expected. He raised his head slightly, not high, but enough to see the crowd below. Some of these people's faces were happy, some were sad and some were full of greed, and everything was as he expected. Roger said, "Do you want my treasure? If you want, you can give it all to you, go find it." As soon as the words came out, the two executioners frowned and looked at each other, feeling that something was wrong, and then raised the knife tacitly, but Roger did not wait for them, but continued, "I put all my treasures there." S.A. The two knives stabbed and pierced Roger's body, but he still had a smile on his face, and his eyes were also looking into the distance. There was the sea. Crash. For a while, the whole square boiled, and different voices intertwined, making it impossible to hear what they were saying and shouting. In the attic, Vorgonas frowned, breathing in smoke, and there was a trace of astonishment on her face. It seemed that Roger's execution ended in such a scribbled way, which did not meet her expectations. "That's the Pirate King. Don't you even have the qualifications to say a complete sentence?" However, what made her even more upset happened. The originally clear sky turned into dark clouds that were visible to the naked eye. With the first sound of thunder, it rained like a torrential downpour. Voganus turned her head and looked at the girl with her feet padded, her head resting on her shoulders, with an expression of "I said it a long time ago," opened her mouth, and finally said nothing. But her movements were very neat. She shook her shoulders, making the girl's head leave her shoulders. Then she reached out and grabbed the raincoat hood on the girl's head. With a single touch, the whole raincoat was taken off. The next second, it was put on her body. The girl frowned and said dissatisfiedly, "Vorgonas. That's my raincoat. You take my boat. It's normal for you reading www.yuyuganshu.com to pay some tolls." Having said that, Voganus turned around and headed towards the port. Skyla followed closely, and went downstairs, chasing, and shouting, "Vorgonas, we are going to eat barbecue and buy famous knives. Are you heading in the wrong direction? Not in the mood." As Voganus said, she turned a corner. The girl braked suddenly and accidentally hit a man's back. The man turned his head and stared at the girl with golden eyes. The girl held up her sunglasses, which were covered with raindrops, and was very calm. She didn't seem to have the attitude of apology that she should have when she bumped into someone. Shouting from the front, "Vorgonas! Someone is staring at me!" Voganus turned around obediently, walked between Skyla and the man, looked at the man, and said, "Is something wrong?" The man's golden eyes crossed Vorgonas and looked at the two sabers, one long and one short at the back of the girl, as well as the empty hands. He shook his head and did not speak. Voganus was about to leave with Skyla, and when she was standing shoulder to shoulder with the man finally said, "If you want to buy a knife, you can go to the east and sell one." Hearing this, Skyla stopped, pushed on his sunglasses, and asked, "Is there a famous knife there?" "Have you didn't buy it? Those knives are too bad for me." Hearing this, Skyla turned around and said to Vorgonas, who also stopped in front of him, "Vorgonas, let's go after the barbecue. The knife he doesn't like, I don't like either." The man raised his eyebrows and looked at the girl with two swords, one long and one short, one black and one white, without saying a word. "Skyla, let me ask you a serious question, do you really want to be a navy?" On a small boat, Voganus asked Skyla, seeing Skyla nodding without hesitation, and said, "Then you are now on a pirate ship, aren't you afraid of being offered a bounty?" "Cut." The girl moved the sword box in front of her, then lay down, and said, "You also said that you received an invitation from the world government to become the king of the 7 Martial Seas, but you don't even have a crew member, no, not even a single crew member. There is no pirate flag." Hearing this, Vorgonas clenched her hand holding the eaves of the boat, and said bluntly, "That's a bunch of damned men who don't want to follow a woman, even if that woman defeated him." She didn't even know the winner's name. "Dare to speak out? Is that why you debuted under the stage name Crocodile? And why you challenged Whitebeard?" Skyla raised her back slightly, pushed aside the long silver hair that was under her body, and lay down again. It seemed that the pressure on her hair made her uncomfortable and her movements were rusty. But Voganas ignored her, looked at the sea, nodded, and said, "That's right, how about you? If you want to become a navy, you can sign up for conscription in any town, right? Why do you want to find by with me?" Beard. Skyla looked at the sky, raised his slender hand, moved it gently in the air, as if blocking the sun, and said, "Because I want to be a real man." Hearing this, Voganas turned around, looked at the girl lying on the boat, was silent for a while, and said, "Have you also experienced injustice? These damned men." Seeing that Vorgonas seemed to have misunderstood something, Skyla raised her eyebrows and did not explain. In her line of sight, there was a panel that no one else could see at the position of her raised hand. With the flick of her finger, a task interface appeared. Mission name: Be a real man. Mission requirements: Justice is executed. Defeat the pirate with the highest bounty at sea. Quest reward: Restore the host gender, retain the inheritance effect, and officially open the quest system. Quest objective: Gore D. Roger, 5,564,800,000. Objective invalid Edward Newgate, 5,046,000,000. Task status: Incomplete. Mission time limit: 1,396 hours. Looking at this series of lists, as well as the list that was updated in real time, the girl sighed. It was only a last-ditch effort to challenge Whitebeard in such a short amount of time. With her current strength, it is completely impossible to defeat Whitebeard, not to mention the current Whitebeard. Even 22 years later, she can't beat that old and debilitated Whitebeard now. As a traverser, she came to the world of One Piece, but she has more than a month. Even if she has the inheritance of the extremely accomplished Blade Shadow template, she is just a weak chicken. After all, it is only the inheritance template, and cultivation still depends on herself. Especially along with this inheritance, there is the image of Blade Shadow, the image of a beautiful girl. One thing to say, Skyla likes a girl like her very much, but she doesn't want to be such a girl. And if she wants to restore her former gender, she can only defeat the pirate with the highest bounty at sea in 100 days. If she is Roger's executioner, she may have already completed it. But within a month, Skyla was completely too late to join the Navy. After all, the Navy without that branch would want a girl who was only 14 or 15 years old and had no identity proof. For more than a month, Skyla, in addition to cultivating, found Vons. Vons was the name that the woman in front of him said, and Skyla didn't know the truth. After all, when she met Vons, she clearly told the male pirate she was down that her name was Crocodile, but Skyla didn't care if the woman told him her real name. After all, Skyla also not a real name. Skylar's real name was intended to be used after she regained her gender, but she didn't know whether she could complete this task. After all, with her current strength, even Voganas could completely abuse her. The girl was melancholy, and there was a touch of sympathy and tenderness on Voganas' face that had never been seen before. She followed the girl's hair and looked at the sea in the distance. As a woman, Vorgonas is well aware that a woman is in a situation where it is difficult to walk on this sea. Even though she has now offered a bounty of 80 million, the world government has even issued an invitation letter to the King's Seven Seas. But Vorgonas's reward order doesn't even have a picture of herself, Crocodile. This is the only information she has on the reward order. There is no man who fought against her and was defeated by her. He will tell others that he lost to a woman, and no pirate is willing to board her ship and become her crew. What those men wanted was to conquer her in any place and under any circumstance, not to be conquered by her. even if it was just to be her crew member, they were unwilling. Even the world government didn't know that the king Shishibukai they invited was actually a woman. Therefore, Voganus never replied to the world government to do a big vote. Vorgonus swears. She wants everyone to know her and recognize her. Since then, challenging and defeating the strongest man in the sea has become the best way. Roger One Piece has died, which makes her extremely regretful, just like Skyla. And they can only settle for the next best thing, that is to defeat the Whitebeard Edward Newgate, who is second only to the Pirate King Roger in the bounty. They have a common goal, and they all believe, or can only believe that they have a bright future. The boat that Voganus and Skyla were on was very fragile, and they couldn't stick to the great route at all. Both of them knew that when they encountered a pirate ship, the two sacked the pirate group with great tacit understanding. The reason for their actions is very simple, one is because these pirates look down on women, and the other is because these pirates regard her as a woman. Fortunately, the pirate ship they looted also returned from the Great Channel to watch Roger's execution of the pirate group, so it shouldn't be a problem to pass the upside-down mountain. Because there had never been a crew, Voganus was forced to become a decathlon captain, and after a few days, the two of them arrived at the Great Channel without any risk. The two began to sail on the Great Waterway. Along the way, they encountered many challenges, but with the help of Vanas, who was not clear about her identity, she was offered a reward of 80 million and was invited to become the big pirate of the Kaiwohe. Yu reading www.yuuganshu.com is going well. After all, the current Skyla, at most, has to deal with those trainee crew members who don't even have positions. Of course, they are talking about the trainee crew members of the pirates who are qualified to go to the Great Route, not the small pirates from all over the world, or the great pirate group that became famous in the New World. Finally, when Skylar's mission time limit was only a dozen hours left, Skyla, who had no love, finally saw a big ship and 4 foreign ships guarding it. Vorgonus! Wake up! Moby Dick! It's Moby Dick! Skyla excitedly patted Vorgonus, who snatched his sunglasses and took them to shade during a nap. Vorgonus frowned, but did not get up immediately, but said slowly, "You are so anxious to die." Voganus arched her waist gracefully, then stood up lightly, and inserted the sunglasses back into Skylar's hair, just when Skyla was a little puzzled that this woman had such a laid-back side. Voganus suddenly stepped on the head of the ship and shouted to the huge Moby Dick not far away, "Whitebeard! The head is ready, I will take it now." Skylar's face was speechless. The next second, at the fence of Moby Dick's mother ship, a man with short blonde messy short hair, about 20 years old, looked at it and turned back and shouted, "Dad! 2 beautiful girls are coming for you." "Damn Marco! What are you talking about?" Ahaha! On the Moby Dick, there were suddenly some laughter and scolding. There was continuous laughter on the boat, but on a boat that was only less than half the height of the Moby Dick, Voganus' face was already red, even though this happened every day, but this way of treating women was to make she is very upset. Kula la la la! A laughter that overwhelmed the crowd spread, and a man with blonde hair and a crescent-shaped white beard in a captain's hat appeared at the railing. Whitebeard looked at Vorgonus and Skyla on the boat below, and said cheerfully, "Come on, we are celebrating that Roger that is finally dead." On the side, Marco's head popped up again and said, "Dad, we've been holding banquets for 2 months in a row, are we still celebrating? Isn't it too much?" Kula la la la! That's a pure banquet." Whitebeard scratched his temples and laughed out loud again. Below, Voganus couldn't help it, her legs turned into quicksand, pushing her towards the Moby Dick. Skyla scratched his head, then took off the sunglasses from his hair, put them on, and then jumped lightly, and followed Voganus on the Moby Dick. Looking around, Skyla found that there was indeed a banquet on the deck, as Whitebeard had said, and many of them were already drunk, and it was noon. But there was not much laughter on the deck at this time, maybe it was because of the arrogant way of appearance of Voganus. After all, the fruit person, even on the great waterway, is a person who deserves serious treatment, even if it is just a woman. Kulalalala. Whitebeard was still laughing, and then said, a woman with the ability of natural fruit, and a girl Jian Hao, it's really interesting. Kulalala. Bang. While Whitebeard laughed, he raised the bottle and wanted to drink it, but Vaughn's shot directly, and the quicksand smashed the bottle. In just a moment, Whitebeard's smile disappeared, and many people around him also used serious. His eyes turned to Vogan's beautiful wine. But a man who walks on the sea is the best companion. Whitebeard looked at Vogan's and said, then brought the broken wine bottle to his mouth, and drank every drop of wine cherished, just like a lost person in the desert encounters clear water. I'm here to challenge you, not to drink. Not to listen to you talk about the truth between men. After Vanna's finished speaking, half of her body turned into yellow sand and swooped towards Whitebeard. Beside Whitebeard, a crew member handed over his saber, Kong Yunkai. But Whitebeard raised his hand to reject the crew, raised his other hand, instantly turned pitch black, and grabbed the huge blade made of yellow sand. Ping bell pong. Under the collision, many dishes and wine bottles fell to the ground, and Whitebeard's face was expressionless, but as the attacking party, Vorgona's, the half of her face that had not turned into quicksand, was already struggling. Expression. Impossible. How can it be so strong? Vogan's shouted in her heart. She was a strong man who could compete with the cotters of the Roger pirates at the age of 20. How could he be blocked by Whitebeard so easily? Moreover, what displeased Vogan's most was Whitebeard's refusal to use Kong Yunkai's attitude. At this time, Whitebeard fluttered and let go of the giant blade that Vogan's had transformed into, and Vogan's took back the quicksand, turned back into human form, and charged towards Whitebeard. As for the crew on the ship, many of them withdrew their attention at this time. For them, Vogan's was just another weak person trying to defeat their father and gain fame and status. Damn! Saw the reaction of the crew members in the corner of the eye, Vogan's was even more angry, leaping high, her right hand turned into a machete, smaller than before, but her strength was indeed more solid. Damn! Do your best for me, bastard! Desert sword. Although it was only for a moment, Whitebeard's pupils dilated a little, because the sand was actually wrapped with a purple-black luster, but very weak. Boom! Whitebeard pushed it out with one palm and collided with Vorgonas's desert sword. Vorgonas flew upside down and hit the railing beside Skyla before stopping. As a woman, you are already very good, get off the boat, we are going to continue the banquet. Kula la la la. Whitebeard looked at the fallen Vorgonas, turned and walked towards his original position, and laughed heartily, saying that Vorgonas was already very good, but he was not even interested in asking her name. As a woman, Vorgonas didn't show anger this time, because the anger on her face was no longer enough to express her anger. She got up, and regardless of her injuries, she charged towards Whitebeard again. Whitebeard turned his head and looked at this somewhat ignorant woman. He snorted, and in an instant, an invisible force spread toward the surroundings. In the air, Vorgonas, whose hands turned into 4 quicksand scimitars, felt as if she had been attacked. Thump! Her eyes were scattered, and she was about to fall, but in the next instant, unyielding anger rekindled in her eyes, and she forcibly resisted Whitebeard's rushing aura. Whitebeard was a little surprised, reached out and grabbed Kong Yunki, who had been holding in the crew's hands. Want me to do my best? What an interesting person! Whitebeard said in his heart. The cloud cut in his hand, the blade turned black, and seeing the domineering sense of Vanna's distance, he turned around and swung the knife with all his strength. Work hard to survive! Whitebeard roared, the blade slashed, and his aura bursting in an instant, and the constantly cracking air around him, shocked Vorgonas again, and even the desert sword that she had transformed into returned to her arms. Whitebeard looked at the almost perfect woman in front of him. Yu reading www.yuuganshu.com's eyelids moved, but he couldn't bear to change the direction of the blade. A broken arm was abandoned high, and Voganus sat directly on the ground. After the blow, Whitebeard completely restrained his breath and strength, and looked at Voganus in front of him. Voganus looked at her empty left hand, raised her head, and said, "Finally, why do you have to pull back? Just because I'm a woman? No, I tried my best." Whitebeard stood with a sword and a smile on her face, but Voganus obviously didn't believe Whitebeard's answer, so she stood up lonely, with the only right hand left. She grabbed the broken left arm and moved towards Skyla. "Go! Come on, Skyla!" Whitebeard didn't care about the blood flowing on the deck, but laughed loudly, "Kula la 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 woman, what's your name?" Voganus did not answer, but urged Skyla with her eyes. Skyla ignored it, took a few steps forward, picked up the saber dropped by someone on the deck, and said, "Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, I'm also here to challenge you." No, it should be said, early arrest. Whitebeard froze for a moment, looked at the girl who was only 14 or 15 years old, and laughed again. "Kulalalala, after that old Roger died, there are still such interesting people, kulalalala." The last laugh was a little pale. But Skyla ignored it, raised the saber he picked up from the deck with his right hand and pointed it at Whitebeard, while his left hand was already placed on the blade box at his waist, on the white short knife. White Fang double slash. Skyla charged forward, jumped up, moved both hands, two swords, and launched an attack at the laughing Whitebeard at the same time. Stab! The sound of clothes being torn rang out, and the Moby Dick was silent, and then everyone stood up and looked at Whitebeard. I saw that the Whitebeard at this time was wearing a captain's suit, and 4 slits were cut. On his chest, there were 2 intersecting wounds, and blood beads were oozing at this time. Skylar, who swung out his 2 knives and just landed, before he had time to return the short blade of White Fang, was also shocked. She never thought that she could hit Whitebeard, but that's what happened. Looking at the bleeding wound on Whitebeard's chest, she wondered if it was her attack that had the effect of a forced hit. But the next moment, she denied it. For more than a month, in addition to sailing and training, she also fought every day, and she also learned from Vanas, but her attacks did not have such a regular effect. Although the swordsmanship she inherited is exquisite, but swordsmanship is just swordsmanship, it is not digitized, there are no strict restrictions, and there are no rules. Then the only possibility is that Whitebeard didn't want to dodge or resist at all. She raised her head and looked at the giant who was 4 or 5 times her height, looking at the calm eyes in his eyes. "You just let me chop like that?" Skyla took 2 steps back so that she wouldn't have to raise her head completely. Whitebeard looked at the puzzled look on the girl's face and laughed loudly. "Kulalalala, could it be that you want me to take action on a little girl? You too, why are you nervous?" As he said that, he looked at the sons who were watching him, and while laughing loudly, he wiped away the blood beads on his chest. The blade of the girl's full blow only slightly cut his skin. When everyone saw this, they all turned their heads. It was time to drink, and it was time to chat. Skyla continued to stare at Whitebeard and said, "Then if you don't stop me, can I chop off your neck?" "Kulalalala, okay. With a glass of wine, I'll let you chop my neck once." Whitebeard laughed wantonly, even put down Kong Yunki, pulled a chair to sit down, and then put a bottle of wine and a glass in front of Skyla. Then, Whitebeard looked at Marco and said, "The banquet continues, stop the bleeding for that woman. The more people at the banquet, the better." Marco scratched his messy blonde hair and walked towards Vorgonas. Seeing this, Vorgonas was about to jump off the Moby Dick, but Marco grabbed Vorgonas. The fruit's ability was activated in an instant, and Vorgonas didn't even have time to refuse, when she found that her left arm was no longer bleeding. Then, Marco said, "Let's stay and celebrate together." Ignoring the look that Vorgonas was about to kill him, Marco walked back to Whitebeard, reached out and poured a glass of wine for Skyla. Skyla took the knife, looked at the wine in front of him, and then looked at the chair lying on the chair. The Whitebeard even raised his head slightly. It is good. The girl's words were brief. She put the short white tooth blade back into the blade case, took the wine glass, and gulped it down in one gulp. Her body, which had never been in contact with alcohol, was very repelled by the wine, and while coughing, the girl swallowed the wine. Then he raised his head, looked at Whitebeard and said, "One strike." Whitebeard laughed loudly. Skyla had already snatched the bottle from Marco's hand and poured it for himself. The girl was very honest, and every time, it was a full glass. An hour later, the swaying girl, holding a knife, was in front of the Whitebeard as if receiving a haircut, and a knife slashed on the neck of the Whitebeard. The drunk girl couldn't even hold the knife, let alone break the tough skin of the Whitebeard. After one operation, there were a lot of golden hairs on the ground. It's like, Whitebeard really came for a haircut, and the drunk girl was the hairdresser. When only the last knife was left, the girl was constantly accumulating strength, or in other words, trying to stabilize her figure. That appearance caused the crew on the Moby Dick to laugh, and even Vanas, who was forced to stay behind, laughed. Covered their eyes. "Little Skyla. There's only one knife left, this time, use more force." On the side, Marco, who was also drunk, even started to cheer for the girl who threatened to cut off her father's neck. As soon as the words came out, many crew members also cheered for the girl. Under the spotlight, the girl was a buttock, fell on the deck, and then fell head first. She reached out her hand and subconsciously helped the sunglasses that had been slanted to the side, and said, "Finally, the last sword hiccup, wait until I wake up, and then cut, don't be a fool." Saying that, the girl fell into a deep sleep, and for a while, the deck of the Moby Dick was full of laughter and laughter. For a body that has not been baptized by alcohol, the first time he gets drunk is always very long. When Skyla woke up, it was the next day, close to dawn. She is not lying on the deck, but lying on a reclining chair, covered with an old but very clean cotton jacket. The girl was in a drowsy state, enduring the splitting headache. She called up her system panel, looked at the task failure notification above, and fell into deep silence on the task panel that had already dimmed. She will be bound in this body for a long time. She turned her head weakly and looked at the crew of the Whitebeard pirates lying on the deck, as well as the Whitebeard who was snoring loudly. Despair grew in her heart. After lying down for a while, she stood up and found Vorgenes, who was holding the mast and holding a wine bottle in her right hand. Skyla kicked the woman, but there was no other response except for snoring. The girl carried the woman who was much taller and heavier than her with difficulty and walked towards the edge of the deck. When she reached the railing, a voice came, "A girl who is inspired to become a naval king. Don't you cut the last knife." Skyla turned around in a panic, saw the sleepy Whitebeard, and Marco, who was scratching his messy blonde hair, and said, "Keep it. Save it until I become a navy, and then chop." "Kulalalala, still don't forget to become a navy? Why don't you stay on the ship and become my first daughter?" Whitebeard's hearty and unrestrained laughter made many crew members wake up, and when they heard Whitebeard's words, they all looked at the girl. "I won't become a pirate. I'm Skyla. Even if I starve to death. If I die outside, jump from here and drown, I won't become a pirate." The girl seemed to be very resistant to becoming a pirate. After she finished speaking, she really jumped down with Vons on her back. Marco immediately ran to the railing, and at a glance, he was sure that the two had landed on his original boat. Was relieved. But in the next moment, Marco's mood immediately turned sour, because the girl who was as beautiful as a porcelain doll pointed his to him. "Pirates who go to hell, next time we meet, I will arrest you all and throw them in jail." The girl rolled up the anchor, pulled up the sail, and the boat went away. Her words of ruthless when she said goodbye brought a lot of laughter to the Moby Dick at this sunrise. "Then let's stop here. The Golden Lion attacked Marin Vondo. If you apply for the Navy exam now, it may be easier. On the Great Voyage, there are only 2 women on a pirate ship. No, it should be said that there is a woman and a girl. The woman is holding a wine bottle and looking at the night, saying melancholy, she is putting it down. Newspaper. I just don't know if I can join the navy without any identification. Skyla was playing with the cigar that Vorgonas gave her. She doesn't smoke, but she likes to smell the cigar that hasn't been lit. She can smell a caramel mixed with chocolate. Vorgonas drank the remaining wine, and then started to untie the lifeboat hanging by the side of the boat, which was only big enough for 2 or 3 people. It was a little difficult to operate with one hand, but she still did it stubbornly. In fact, she can use a better way, that is, elementalize her left arm, and make quicksand as flexible as her hands according to Vorgonas's grasp of the fruit. There is no problem at all, but she did not listen to the girl's suggestion. She couldn't get off the lifeboat all the time, which made Vons a little irritable. She gave up temporarily, kicked the wine bottle off the deck, turned to the girl and said, I just don't understand, why do you have to join the navy? Don't you know that there are dirty things in the navy too? I know. The girl turned her head, put the sunglasses on her forehead, temporarily acting as a hairpin, and said, isn't it corrupt, stereotyped, sexist, and Tianlongren's dog, I know all about it. Vorgonas was rather puzzled and said, so, you know this, but you still want to join the navy. Well, compared to the corruption and other filth of the navy, I think what they are doing is at least more useful than what other professions can do. The corruption of the few, the justice of the majority, the cruelty of the majority, and the innocence of the few, I choose the former. As she spoke, the girl walked up to Vorgonas and helped her relieve the lifeboat. Puff! The bottom of the lifeboat hit the water, splashing a lot of water. Skyla looked at the boat below and said, then I'll go, you can be a pirate, and when I become a navy, arrest you. What are you doing? Vorgonas smiled and looked at the girl who was about to climb down, and said, I don't need such a big boat, and I have to do one thing first, such a big boat will affect my actions too much. You mean, that boat was prepared for you? Skyla frowned. It was clear that this place was very close to Malinfando. She would be able to arrive at the island where Marine Fando was located in 3 or 4 days at most. She didn't need such a large ship, and she didn't need so many supplies. Vorgonas shook her head, did not answer, but changed the subject and said, can I have a look at your knife? Which one? The girl was very generous, moved the blade box to her body, and let Vorgonas choose. Vorgonas pulled out the white short-bladed white teeth and said, the short one will do. Saying that, Vorgonas turned sideways, looked at the sea, and looked at the boat swaying on the water beneath her feet. With a long leg, a backpack flew down and hit the boat precisely. Vorgonas took a deep breath and said, I'm afraid that the next time you meet, you won't recognize me. Remember this. When arresting, don't arrest the wrong person. Saying that, Vorgonas moved the hand holding White Fang lightly. Tick tick, a drop of blood fell on the deck, and some fell low in the sea. The speed of the drop of blood gradually accelerated, and soon became a string. Vorgonas turned around, revealing 2 rows of white teeth. But Skyla only cared about the woman's nose, and the wound on both sides, reaching the sideburns. Skyla reached out and wanted to check the wound on Vorgonas' face, but as soon as his hand reached out, he grabbed the woman and handed it back. Short blade. The woman had already jumped onto the boat, with a smile still on her face. She raised her empty left arm and waved it hard, as if saying goodbye. It was not until the night engulfed the sight of the 2 of them that Skyla heard from a distance, came the cry. I'm sorry, little Skyla, I'm going to be a real man. You are hiding in Marivendo, wait for me to destroy you. Skyla paced angrily, walked back to the deck chair to lie down, put the sunglasses back where they should be, and complained, damn Vanas, I'm going to the Shemale King without bringing any. Go to labor. Next to it, on the small round table, there was a recording pointer, and the position pointed by the pointer was the girl's destination Marine Fando, the headquarters of the Navy. 3 days later, advancing the city to the channel in the middle of Marine Fando, a warship with the head of a dog was sailing. On the deck, a vice-admiral with half black hair and half white hair was eating senbei and looked at the 2 ships in the distance. Pirate ship. This lieutenant general experienced a sea breeze that he hadn't experienced for a long time. The sea breeze blew his righteous cloak, and the black suit on his body was propped up by his tall frame and plump muscles. Next to him, a young lieutenant with some childishness on his face, holding a telescope, observed the situation on the 2 pirate ships, and said, "One is the Ironbone pirates with a total bounty of 170 million, and the other, only 1 girl." When the lieutenant spoke, he was a little hesitant. The lieutenant general was stunned, and then snatched the lieutenant's binoculars. He looked as expected, as the lieutenant said, although there were many people on the other ship. But obviously, they were all besieging a girl. Obviously, those people all passed from the ship of the Ironbone pirates, and it seemed that the little girl was struggling a little. "Bogart! Drive the ship over, there are pirates who dare to fight here, I really don't care about the Navy." "Yes, Lieutenant General Garp." Lieutenant Bogart took the lead, and Garp had a very confident expression on his face. "Today's Navy has just executed Roger, ending the era of evil. A few days ago, he and the warring states had just defeated the Golden Lion to take custody and advance the city. At this time, there are pirates who dare to fight here. It really doesn't give face to the Navy." Garp was munching on the senbei hard, but he seemed to be using every muscle fiber on his face, even though it was a crispy senbei. You reading www.youcanshu.com. Bogart came back soon, looked at Garp, thought about it, and said, "Lieutenant General Garp, that little girl is not a pirate. I just checked the reward order, and there is no reward order for this girl." The origin of the ship was also found out. It belonged to the Black Wave Pirates. The Black Wave Pirates had already captured all the crew in the East China Sea some time ago. That ship was not the girl's. Hearing this, Garp stopped chewing, and then said, "That is to say, a group of pirates are bullying a girl." While speaking, shards of senbei flew out and sprayed Bogart on Bogart's face. Bogart just wiped it away, and then said, "Lieutenant General Garp, shall we save that girl?" Garp swallowed Xianbei and then said, "Did you not hear the lesson of the crane last time? Your behavior is serious and discriminatory against women. It's not allowed in the future, you know." "Understood, Lieutenant General Garp, then. Let's go over." Garp ordered, and then said confidently, "But look. That girl will never ask for help. Women who dare to go to sea alone are very brave." Bogart nodded in agreement, but no one knew what he was thinking. As the iconic warship approached, the members of the Ironbones pirates stopped, and many even showed fearful expressions. Garp stood at the bow of the boat and looked at these little trash fish with a look of disdain. He looked at the girl, thinking that the girl would refuse his help, but when the girl saw him, she held up her sunglasses with her wrist and said loudly, shouted, "Lord Navy! Help! Some pirates want to kill me." In an instant, Bogart looked at Garp subconsciously, and Garp's face turned petrified. The sea breeze was a little impatient, and the blowing Garp was also a little impatient. Next to his warship, there were 2 broken pirate ships, and many navies were arresting those pirates. Garp squatted, looking at the little girl who was about the same height as him, with disbelief on her face, and said, "You just, requesting help from the Navy? We help you, you won't feel gender discrimination." The girl raised her sunglasses and said, "Why do you feel sexist when you ask for help? If you say so, it's real sexism. Does your Navy have a channel to report sexism? I want to report that I was sexist by Vice Admiral." A series of sexism made Garp's face change directly, and then, with a goldfish-like smile, he took out the senbei and said, uncle invites you to eat the senbei, don't talk nonsense. Other Garp is not afraid, even if someone reports him for betraying the navy, he doesn't care, but sexism is no good, at least there is a crane, no. The girl was not polite, she stretched out her hand and dragged the senbei bag over, and said, I haven't eaten barbecue for a long time, and my mouth has been idle. When my mouth is idle, I like to talk and get busy. Eat. Eat big pieces. Are 2 pieces enough? Saying that, Garp stood up and instructed the Navy soldiers to prepare. The girl looked at the arm that weighed her entire body, and shut her mouth very wisely, without taking an inch. Seeing that the little girl was starting to quiet down, Garp squatted down again, looked at the short and thin little girl, and said, Little friend, why did you appear here? Where are your parents? I don't have parents. As for how I got here, I heard that this is the headquarters of the Navy, so I grabbed a ship and came here. The girl was holding the senbei in one hand and the bag in the other. As she spoke, the sunglasses that covered half of her face showed signs of slipping, so she hurriedly supported it with the back of her hand. And Garp, rubbing his donut-like beard on his mouth at this time, said, Why are you going to the Navy headquarters? Attack. As soon as the words came out, Garp felt that the girl was rolling his eyes at him. Even through the sunglasses, Garp could see it. The expression on his face was a little embarrassed. Garp hurriedly said, You're here to join the Navy, right? But why did you come to the Navy headquarters? After speaking, Garp gave himself a big mouth. He has the ability to go to the Great Waterway alone, why should he join the branch of the 4 seas? The girl watched Garp's one-man show. She didn't even eat the senbei. She leaned against the railing and just watched. Garp smiled awkwardly and said, What's your name? Skyla. Just Skyla. Can't you? This time, Garp finally laughed and said, Last name and first name, haha, don't you only have your first name? The girl frowned, thought for a while, and said, Gray, Skyla Gray. Garp looked at the girl and said, Your name is Gray? Or Skyla? Skyla. Then you are Gray Skyla, not Skyla Gray. With his elbows on his knees and his palms on his chin, Garp said, hearing this, the girl's brows furrowed even tighter, What's wrong with this world? It's obviously an English name, why is the name on the back? Skyla Gray, my name is on the front. Ahaha, what an interesting little kid. Garp tried to avoid all the words that might be related to sexism, and then said, Skylar, if you want to join the Navy, why don't you go back to Marivendo with your uncle? You just smashed my boat. I don't want to swim with your boat, can you? The girl's incomparably calm voice made Garp's expression froze. He looked past the girl and looked at the sea, the broken boat, and laughed again. Ahaha, why don't you follow me in the future? After Kuzan leaves, I'm still short of a deputy. Cough cough. Aside, Bogart coughed. Garp looked over and asked, Bogart, do you have a cold? Bogart shook his head and said, Lieutenant General Garp, Marshal Kong has already assigned you a deputy. Really? Garp got up, approached Bogart, and said, Who is it? No one told me. Bogart's forehead seemed to have blood vessels beating. He endured all his emotions and said as calmly as possible, Lieutenant General Garp, it's me, and I'm your deputy. Ahaha, you're so funny, ahaha. Garp seemed to be amused and covered his stomach, but he stopped laughing when he saw Bogart's gradually grey face, and said, Aren't you kidding? Pthaha kikia. A similarly demonic laughter appeared. It was the girl who was choked by eating senbei. Bogart looked at the girl's faceless appearance, subconsciously forgot his sadness, and laughed out loud. Seeing the two of them were laughing, Garp suddenly laughed too. Below, the pirates were handcuffed, a little puzzled. They were just little pirates. Is it worth this naval hero to be so happy to capture them? Sometimes, joy only needs an inexplicable reason. When the pirates below are all imprisoned and the navy on the ship is preparing to barbecue, the three people at the bow are still in a happy atmosphere. Yu reading www.yuyugonshu.com. Barbecue is in front of her. Ever since the Moby Dick got off, she hadn't eaten anything serious. The light in the eyes of the girl who had been eating dry food was about to pierce through the pair of sunglasses. Seeing this, Carp crossed his hips and said, "Eat. Eat until you're full." "Thank you. You are a good navy," the girl said, and immediately ran to the chair that was just brought over, and then began to scrape the barbecue on the table. If there is anything good in the world of One Piece, it is that the barbecue is particularly delicious. Carp was still smiling with his arms crossed. When he thought about how much barbecue a little girl could eat, when he turned around slowly, both eyes almost flew out of their sockets. That's nearly 10 adult men's barbecue, and in such a short time, a third of it has disappeared. You know, Cap's lunch is also in it. Ignoring the promise just now, Garp ran to the girl's side, and he and the girl began to compete for barbecue. He didn't have the image of a naval hero. Garp's strength and speed are completely unmatched by girls at this stage. Seeing that Onet herd of the barbecue disappeared in an instant, the girl became wise and shouted, "Is this what the Navy has to offer? Even a child who was killed has to be robbed of food." Hiccup. The barbecue that Carp hadn't fully swallowed stuck in his throat. Looking at the delicious barbecue, he looked at the girl again, and then reluctantly said, "It's just barbecue. As long as you join the Navy, you can eat as much as you want." Having said that, his eyes were reluctant to take his eyes off the table. The girl saw that the aggressive approach was effective, so she hurriedly started. If Carp came back to his senses later, there would be no meat to eat. "Are you a swordsman with 2 swords?" After the barbecue dinner, Skyla lay down on the reclining chair brought by the Navy without any scruples. Even though he was not even a Navy, he was very comfortable with the feeling of being served by his subordinates. On the side, Lieutenant Bogart pressed his hat. The sea breeze was a bit strong. At the same time, he put his other hand on his saber and showed the girl his saber before asking. The girl looked at Bogart's saber, which was longer than her long sword, obsidian. Her eyes under the sunglasses showed a hint of interest. She shook her head and said, "No, I'm a 3-sword swordsman." Mito Stream. Bogart was also a little curious. He looked at Garp, who was sleeping soundly on the reclining chair. He squatted down following his movements just now, which seemed to have indeed shortened the distance between him and the girl. 3 knives, I've never seen it before. How do you use the 3rd knife? You shouldn't be a fruit person, right? Bogart couldn't imagine how a normal person would use 3 knives, and according to the sea water splashed on the girl when his superior smashed the pirate ship, it didn't seem to hinder her. Therefore, Bogart asked curiously. "Road." Seeing that the young man didn't seem to plan to let her take a nap, Skyla also stood up and said, "Want to see it? It's a pity that I only have 2 knives, so I can't use them." Bogart didn't seem to know what a refusal to create difficulties was. He stood up and walked towards the Navy patrolling on the deck. He directly asked for the saber on one of the Navy's waists. "Delivered," said, "Well." Girl scratching her head. JPG, but she wouldn't flip the words she said on the spot. She stood up helplessly and took the normal-sized saber that Bogart handed over. Of course, this saber is slightly longer than the girl's size, but it doesn't matter. Skyla pulled out the scabbard of the Navy's saber, holding the knife in his right hand, and the other hand on the sword box. Above the short-edged white tooth, perhaps it was the tacit understanding of the swordsman, and Bogart also put his hand on it. On his own sword. Seeing that Bogart was ready, Skyla ignored that there was still a sleeping vice-admiral, and sprinted towards Bogart. When the girl moved, Bogart's eyes narrowed slightly. As a swordsman, eyesight is very important. Bogart, who was only 1 step away from stepping into the realm of swordsman, saw something interesting from Skyla's things. Especially the sword intent that gradually gathered along with Skylar's advance. It seemed that the girl who moved was the state a swordsman should have. Garp, who was sleeping soundly, did not burst the snot bubble on his nose, and continued to uncurl, but he opened one eye, or in other words, one of his eyes, opened a slit. Garp is not good at using swords, but there are many swordsmen and even great swordsmen he has fought against. Roger, the pirate king who holds the supreme sword ace, has two famous swords, Sakura-ten and Muku. The golden lion squid, the white-bearded Edward Newgate, who wears the supremely sharp knife Kong Cloud Cut, has all fought with Garp. Although Garp has always used his fists as a weapon, if he is given a famous sword, then 99% of the swordsmen in this sea area will be chased and chopped by him. Therefore, Garp also felt the difference in the girl's aura at the moment when Skylar's aura changed. No, it should be said that it was the difference in the aura. It was the unique temperament of swordsman. Although weak, too weak to deserve his full awakening, Garp was also watching Skyla. Skyla rushed in front of Bogart and slashed diagonally with her right hand. At the moment of the slash, her speed seemed to increase a bit. Bogart took a step back to avoid the girl's attack range. Skyla stepped forward, pulled out the short-edged white fang in his left hand, and slashed horizontally. Bogart pulled the hilt of his sword and used the scabbard directly to block the girl's attack. Bogart didn't choose to draw the sword, he was just curious how the girl's three swords were used, so he was still waiting for the girl's next attack. The first two knives didn't work, the girl turned around, and the long sword on the blade box stabbed at Bogart. Bogart dodged again, but this time it didn't seem to be that simple. I saw that Skyla took advantage of the situation, and split his legs towards Bogart. Bogart just wanted to block with his hands, but in an instant, the slash hidden between the girl's kicks also struck. Bogart felt a little interesting. He drew his sword to block, and pushed with the trend. The girl seemed to be a little out of balance. It was originally just a movement of turning around for a week, but it failed to stop. Just as Bogart smiled and wanted to comment on the girl's so-called three swords, she saw the girl holding a knife in her back, waving her hands, clearly facing Bogart, but cutting out her own sword. This really surprised Bogart. The moves are very subtle and thoughtful, but too weak. Bogart just swung the long sword with one hand, and the two slashes were directly blocked. The violent counter-shock force finally made the girl completely unbalanced, facing the deck, and fell down. It hurt so much. Rarely, the girl took off her sunglasses and rubbed her nose. If she were a normal person, seeing Skyla who looked like this, she should have helped quickly, but Bogart had a saber in one hand and a scabbard in the other, gesturing. Action of a girl. You just now don't need a third knife at all, you only need this. Bogart was talking and doing movements, trying to prove that the girl's three swords were unnecessary. Skyla was so stimulated that she kept crying because of the pain in her nose. Read www.yuyugonshu.com, but she did not admit defeat, shouting, "Give me a few more years, and you'll be able to see how powerful my three-knife style is." However, if these firm words are matched with the expression of pear blossom and rain, Bogart frowned and said, "You shouldn't create some excess for the so-called three swords." Actions. 1 knife is enough, 2 knives are more than enough, 3 knives. Really unnecessary. Bogart tried hard to correct the girl's kendo path, but Skyla ignored her. When the pain subsided, she put on her sunglasses again and said, "If you are the world's largest swordsman, it's a bit convincing to say that, no, the world's largest swordsman, it's impossible to change my kenshin." Bogart looked at the stubborn Skyla and wanted to persuade, but at this time, a lazy voice came from the sea. "Allah, is this my successor? You're actually bullying a little girl." The voice spread, and the snot bubble on Garp's nose burst. He sat up and laughed loudly. "Kuzan, what are you doing?" A tall and thin figure wearing a cloak of justice, riding a bicycle, flew up from the sea, and then landed smoothly on the deck. Kuzan let go of the bicycle handle, rubbed his hands together, and said, Marshal Kong said there was a pirate battle here, let me come over and see, but it looks like you should deal with them, right? Ahaha, it's not the pirates fighting, it's this little kid fighting with a group of pirates. Hearing Carp's words, Kuzan turned his head and looked at Skyla, whose nose was flushed, with crystal tears on his cheeks. Then, he shook his head and said, Alas Lieutenant General Carp, you are joking again. Seeing the calm but determined expression on Kuzan's face, Skyla sniffed, turned around, looked at Garp, who was laughing, and said, Lieutenant Garp. Who should I complain to about sexism in the Navy? The problem. Carp's laughter stopped abruptly, but in the next second, he reacted. The person Skyla said of sexism should be Lieutenant General Kuzan in front of him, not himself. He laughed even more happily. Skyla said, when you arrive at Malinfando, you can just go to Lieutenant General he. She has been very sensitive to this recently, and I don't know if she is here. Carp's words were interrupted, and he didn't say any more. After all, the girl in front of him, but looking at him, Carp was not an idiot, how could he be caught? Kuzan, who was beside him, scratched his head and said, You mean, those pirates were really defeated by you? What an amazing little girl! I didn't defeat those pirates, but I'm pretty sure that I will tell Admiral Crane about you. The girl tried to identify Kuzan's identity at this time, and then said, Admiral Kuzan of the Navy Headquarters, sexism thing. Looking at this reluctant girl, Kuzan said lazily, Allah, I was actually threatened, little girl, you are just a child, sexism between men and women is not available to you. On the head. Skyla pushed on his sunglasses and said, Sexism, ageism, I believe that Lieutenant General Crane will be very interested and take this matter seriously, right? Lieutenant General Carp. Kuzan frowned and looked at this little girl who didn't know what to do. He didn't like the little girl in front of him, but Carp laughed and said, Ahaha Kuzan, if Skyla doesn't report it, I will report it too. At this moment, Carp didn't even dare to use the adjective small, but called Skylar's name directly, then looked at Kuzan with a sullen expression, and said, Why don't you treat me and Skyla for a week's barbecue, and we'll spare you. Saying that, Carp also looked at Skyla with his eyes and signaled her to stop. Skyla nodded and asked, Is it like 3 meals a day? That's for sure. Carp patted his chest, looked at Kuzan, and asked, How is it? Kuzan looked at Garp, found that he was serious, smoothed his curls with his fingers, estimated Garp's appetite, and his own salary, and then nodded. As for that girl? A little girl of this age doesn't even eat? Kuzan is not worried about what this girl will do. After all, this girl is obviously not from the Navy. Whether you can see Lieutenant General Crane or not, but Lieutenant General Garp, he really can do this kind of bastard. Yes. With his emotions flying, Kuzan saw Bogart, the look in the eyes of this successor. What kind of look was that? Pity? Mercy? Tribute? But Kuzan didn't have time to figure it out. Garp, who was sitting on the reclining chair, had already given high fives to the girl. Carp's warship was not far from Marin Vadadao. After all, the speed of the warship was far higher than Skylar's original ship. At dusk, the warship returned to Marin Vadad smoothly. Skyla was in the port, visiting the naval headquarters. It was not brand new, not even complete. Many craftsmen were repairing the naval base. It seems that the aftermath of the First World War of the Golden Lion Shiki has not been erased. After inquiring about the Navy in charge of managing the warship, Carp learned that his son had not returned from vacation, and his happy expression subsided a lot, and he didn't even have the idea of returning to the Navy headquarters to report. Rolling his eyes, he saw Skyla, who was constantly looking at Marin Vondo, and Kuzan, who was holding a bicycle with one hand in his pocket and the other. He walked over and said, Let's go, it's just dinner, I didn't eat lunch. Fulhahamarinnvondo is not only the headquarters of the Navy. Due to the many generals serving, a small town has also developed here. It is not right to say that it is a small town, but it is scattered on the site outside the military camp or naval buildings. But the basic living facilities, food, clothing, housing, and transportation can be enjoyed. After all, the Navy also has wages, and some generals with higher rank have even dedicated their lives to the Navy career. Some even set up families in Marinvondo, so they also need a place for them to consume and provide household supplies. And Karp is probably more familiar with Marinvondo than his hometown. He took Kuzan and Skyla to a barbecue restaurant. Kuzan was very calm, because he was promoted to lieutenant general soon, and he felt that his salary had risen sharply. Flour. But as the grilled meat was served one after another, and the empty plates slowly piled up on the table, Kuzan's face changed, from lazy at first, to expressionless, to serious, to frowning. In just 1 hour, he had all the expressions a rich man should have to be proletarian. When paying the bill, his forehead even oozes cold sweat. He was not because the meal was too expensive, but because of this kind of treat. 20 times. Kuzan shouldn't be in a cold sweat. As a natural frozen fruit person, all low temperatures will be controlled by him, but, why can't this cold sweat stop? Returning to the dinner table, Kuzan saw 2 people with pleasant faces, both with a cigar in one hand and a toothpick in the other, but the cigar in Skylar's hand was not lit. It seemed that he was simply imitating Karp. Have you paid the bill? Let's go and find the crane with me. Karp stood up, shook the cloak of justice, and put it back on his body. Kuzan frowned and said, Lieutenant General Karp, I'm not saying, I'll treat you to barbecue. Ahaha, don't worry, I'm not the kind of person who breaks his promise, it's just that Skyla needs to find a place to live. Karp smiled and swaggered out of the kebab shop. Kuzan thought for a while, but he pushed his bicycle and quickly followed. Looking at the 2 figures in front of him, one tall and the other short, Kuzan always felt that the 2 had similar temperaments. Is a troublemaker. With Lieutenant Generals Karp and Kuzan leading the way, Skyla was not blocked when he entered the barracks. The Navy on duty at uyugonshu.com just glanced at her and let it go. The 3 of them came to the front of a small courtyard. Karp clenched his iron fist and started to smash the door of the courtyard. Not long after, a middle-aged woman with dark blue and silver-grey long hair appeared. Seeing this elegant woman, Karp waved his hand and said, Zayahi. Why did your movements become so slow? It's because. Karp shut up, because the elegant Lieutenant General Crane had a murderous aura in his eyes that did not match his temperament. Lieutenant General Crane looked at Karp and Kuzan and said, Why are you, master and apprentice, looking for me? Crane didn't see Skyla. After all, no one was in his own territory, and he could see and hear at any time. Skyla stood behind Karp, completely blocked by the large and tall body. Karp stepped aside, revealing Skylar's figure, and said straight to the point, Zayahi, I brought you a future female soldier. She came up the Great Waterway alone and has nowhere to live. Hearing the words, General he took a few steps forward, opened the door of the courtyard, and let a few people in. As he walked towards the door, General he observed the girl who was 2 heads shorter than himself, and was also a little curious. After chatting in the house, the Crane also understood the cause and effect, looked at Skyla, looked up and down again, and said, Swordsman? I have a younger sister who is also a swordsman. Stay, I will take you tomorrow. Get acquainted. As for whether to become a navy, let's talk about it after tomorrow. After all, this is not a new season. After speaking, Crane looked at Karp and said, You should go. Zayahi, I only sat down for 5 minutes. Well, remind me, the sofa will be changed tomorrow. Lieutenant General Crane said to Skyla. Lieutenant General Crane kicked Karp and Kuzan out, closed the door, and looked at Skyla with a smile. The girl was a little uncomfortable, so she looked away unconsciously. He looked at Skyla and said, "So gray." Skyla. Crane tucked the hair around his ears elegantly and said, "Gray Skyla." Skyla showed a hopeless expression on his face, but said stubbornly, "Skyla Gray, I'm the other way around." Although it was not in line with common sense, the crane nodded and said, "I'll arrange a room for you. I hope you don't think the pillow is too high. I have a younger sister who already lives here, and likes a high pillow," he said, and led Skyla upstairs. At the stairs, Skyla asked curiously, "By the way, who can be assigned to a single-family house?" "Lieutenant General." Crane didn't look back, but said, "No, the school level of the headquarters is enough, and the general's house is no different from the major's house, that is, it is closer to the headquarters. The houses allocated by the Navy are all built in a unified way, and considering the size of Marin Vondo, and when Marin Vondo was established, the high-level people at that time put forward the concept of not deliberately dividing classes. Therefore, officers above the school level live in similar houses, the difference lies in the location or their location preference. As for the officers below the school level, including naval cadets, they all live in dormitories. Of course, if you start a family or have savings, you can also buy your own house. As long as it doesn't affect training and execution, the Navy headquarters will not care. The general's house mentioned by the crane is closer to the headquarters. The headquarters here refers to the place where the civilian staff work. Therefore, clerical, teaching and other jobs have become their mainstream. Of course, when the Navy needs them, they are all able to put on capes, set foot on warships, and conquer pirates. Just like Carp, he couldn't be idle, so he asked Marshal Kong to arrange a lot of tasks for him. This is a privilege they have. Of course, Kuzan, who is also a lieutenant general, has insufficient qualifications, so he still has to cruise or execute other tasks with regularity, and periodicity will beat their qualifications. And the girl raised her eyebrows after hearing Crane said that as long as she was a school-level officer of the headquarters, she could own her own house. After all, One Piece watched a lot, and would feel that the school-level officer seemed worthless and ran around everywhere. Crane seemed to sense the restlessness of the girl behind him, and joked, "If you really become a Navy and enter the Naval Academy, if you can graduate with the top 5 grades, then you are directly at the school level. It's just that, every Naval Academy, there will be some geniuses and even some monsters." Said, the crane turned his head and looked at the girl for a while. He didn't mean anything else, just encouragement. After all, no matter how you look at the girl, she is a person who is too weak. Thinking of graduating with the top 5 grades is nothing to talk about. What is the concept of a colonel-level officer? After being promoted from Kuzan, Bogart, who served as Carp's deputy, graduated from a naval cadet for 3 years, worked with Carp for 3 years, and is still a captain. And this captain didn't even need to be serious, he was able to hang Skyla with all his strength. Of course, it was undeniable that Bogart might be a lot stronger than other captains, but he still didn't become a school-level officer. The rank of the Navy headquarters is 3 levels higher than that of the branch. That is to say, it is possible for a Navy who can become a colonel-level officer of the headquarters to be a general in the 4 Seas branch. Therefore, Crane could only encourage this inexplicably confident girl. The conversation between the two was actually very brief. After speaking, they only went up the stairs. There were only 2 rooms on the 2nd floor. They were built opposite, and next to it was the bathroom. Crane pushed open one of the doors. The room is very clean and tidy, and there are very few things on it. It doesn't look like a room, but more like a hotel. Maybe it's because no one has lived in it for too long. The crane pointed to the 3-meter-long bed and said, "This is your temporary room. You can live here until you sign up to become a cadet at the Naval Academy. Don't worry, I won't ask you for rent." As he spoke, seeing the girl's embarrassed expression, he patted her back with a smile. The soft silver hair made he a little envious. At her age, her hair would inevitably become rough. The girl shook her head and said, "It's not this, if I have the rent, I'll give it to you when I have a salary, but I don't have an ID, will I be rejected by the Navy? After all, I may be an undercover pirate." Ha! Crane's aunt smiled, pinched the cheek under the girl's sunglasses, and said, "If you hadn't met Garp, you might have been captured by the pirates, and the pirates would have sent you as an undercover agent." Between the words, there is no word that detracts from the girl's strength, but every word is denying the girl's strength. But Crane still proposed a solution to the girl's lack of identity proof. "However, it is indeed a problem to have no ID, but you are from the Four Seas, so you can apply for a replacement. You were from Donghai before? Where are you from?" The girl was still embarrassed. She shook her head, and the Crane frowned and asked, "Then, how did you come here?" I took a boat to Rogue Town," said. The girl gestured the boat with her hands. She seemed to be serious about using her movements to describe the size of the boat, and then continued, "Then I rowed a boat and wanted to come to the New World. Later, I encountered a pirate ship, and I grabbed it." "So, don't you know where you used to live? The name of the village or town?" Crane walked into the room, sat on the bed and asked the girl. She stood up, and the height difference between Skyla and Skyla was too big. After all, Skyla looked like the kind of girl who was still developing. Yu reading www.yuuganshu.com looks at the dialogue and can get closer. Skyla shook his head, Crane frowned, and thought for a while. When she thought about it, it was absolutely impossible for a 14 or 15-year-old person to not know where the town or village he lived in. Then, the reason is very simple, that is, the girl is reluctant to mention it. Crane is a woman with a gentle heart. Recalling the girl's experience of going out to sea alone, even when she came to the Great Waterway, she wanted to join the Navy. Although it was only for a moment, she thought that the girl might have had a very miserable childhood. Crane looked at the girl again. She was very thin and short, obviously stunted. And for a long time, the girl never took off her sunglasses, even if she was indoors, and at night, she was wearing the pair of sunglasses that were obviously 2 sizes bigger. Perhaps, it was some kind of token. He thought about it, and then looked at the 2 swords, one long and one short, that the girl was carrying. They were very well made, and even the blade case was extremely luxurious, which was incompatible with the girl's cheap leather clothes. In just a few breaths, Crane made up the experience of a girl who was abused in her hometown and went out to sea alone in order to escape from a nightmare, bringing a token and a weapon inherited from her family. Moreover, from the point that this girl came to the Great Waterway, but wanted to join the Navy, this girl is still full of light. Crane's face burst into a light called motherhood, patted the bed, and said, "Let's live here in the future, the rent is just a joke I made. As for your identity, I will help you solve it. It's getting late, I'll go get you clothes and toothbrushes, and rest early." Skyla looked at the kind expression of Grandma who suddenly appeared in the Crane, nodded subconsciously, and said, "Okay." The next morning, before the girl woke up, Crane made breakfast, put it in the kitchen, and then went out to the Navy headquarters building. Unlike Karp, her main job was to train female Navy officers and perform civilian work. After coming to her office, she did not immediately deal with the identity of the girl, but called up some relevant information about the pirate group, especially photos, and then asked people to find information about the missing persons in the East China Sea. Although Crane didn't think Skyla would be an undercover agent, she was a person who didn't even have an identity certificate at the time. Therefore, whether it was for the Navy or Skyla himself, Crane had to try his best to avoid accidents. Soon, the photo information of the Great Channel and the famous pirate group in the New World were all integrated on her desk. The girl's appearance was very unique. If it appeared in the photo, it would be easy to find. In the end, although it was expected, no trace of the girl was found in all the photos, but this also made the crane relieved, but even in the follow-up information on missing persons, the girl was not found, so the crane wrinkled. Raise your brows. Fortunately, the latter is not important. After all, the reporting of the missing persons is completely free to report by the sufferers. If the bidders don't report, they will not be registered. Crane folded her hair, and seeing that it was already bright, she walked out of the office and walked towards Garp's office. She promised to give the girl an identity, so Garp, who was born in the East China Sea, would be very useful. Pushing open the door of Garp's office, Garp was sleeping soundly inside. Adjutant Bogart was helping Garp with the documents. After all, the Golden Lion had just been locked in the advance city, and the follow-up reports all needed to be done. Bogart saw the crane coming, got up and saluted, and then woke up Garp. Garp rubbed his eyes in a daze, then stepped back, put his legs on the desk, and picked up a cigar and matches. Said patiently, "Zia, didn't I tell you not to look for me before 3 o'clock in the afternoon?" Saying that, Garp lit a cigar, looked at the clock on the wall, and said, "It's only 9:30, I just fell asleep. I work for half an hour, I'm very busy." Putting the cigar in his mouth, Garp stretched out his long arm and grabbed a piece of paper from the table at random, and looked at it with a pretentious look. Crane looked at Garp dissatisfied, and said, "Cap, you're holding an ice cream flyer. This kind of thing shouldn't appear in the headquarters." I brought it in. Didn't Marshal Kong say that a small phenomenon might reveal a big conspiracy? I'm just researching. Garp couldn't make it any longer, so he needed the ice cream promotional sheet, threw it aside, and said, "What's the matter?" "Skyla, she has no identification." "No identification?" Garp took the cigar and said, "What's wrong? Is she a pirate undercover?" The little pirates of the pirate group, disguised as civilians without identification, want to infiltrate the navy. This is not the first time it has happened. It has also been mentioned many times in the Naval Academy. Still remember? With a smile on his face, Crane said, "Cap, don't say such an impossible thing." Garp laughed and said, "Ahaha, it's really impossible. Then why are you looking for me?" According to Skylar's own words, she is from the East China Sea. Let her be attached to you, such as niece. He just said that casually. After all, this kind of thing is actually risky, especially for the senior Navy leaders like them. If there is an accident, the responsibility they have to bear is very heavy. Therefore, Crane never thought that Garp would agree, but Garp was in his hometown and knew a lot of people, so he just needed to find someone to hang out with. Sure enough, there was no accident in the crane. Garp shook his head. However, the next second, Garp laughed and said, "Let's just say she's my daughter. A niece or something, it's too complicated. Life is not easy," Zia he sighed. Crane reached out and rubbed his temples, then looked at Garp and said, "Are you serious?" Garp stuffed his sturdy fingers into his nostrils, and while moving, he said, "You also said that you have a sister who is 30 years younger than you." "Wait." Garp suddenly pulled out his fingers, put his legs down, and sat up straight with a serious look on his face. Crane thought that this unreliable comrade in arms was finally able to reason, but the next second, Garp patted the table and said, "Skyla is my daughter, and Drago is her eldest brother." "Bogart." "Yes. Lieutenant General Garp." Bogart saluted, then looked at Garp. Under the watchful eyes of the two, Garp stood up, put his hands on his hips, and said with a sullen expression, "Contact Dirag for Lao Tzu. Just say he has an extra sister, get him back right away." The next second, Bogart and Crane. "Ha ha ha ha, I'm really wise and talented. Now, I see that stinky boy Dirag, how dare he play all over the world." Bogart. "Why are you still standing there? Go." Garp didn't realize how speechless his actions were. The crane retracted his expression, looked at Bogart who picked up the phone and left the office, then turned around and said, Cap, Skyla may not agree, Marshal Kong. Not necessarily allowed. Why? If I can't have more than one daughter, why should I help? Garp put his thick fingers into his nostrils, looking at the crane looked at the rogue Garp, sighed, and said, then I'll ask Skyla, you. Marshal Kong, think of a way. The crane turned around and left. When he passed the door, Bogart hurried back and said, Lieutenant General Karp, Lieutenant General Drago said he would come back soon, but if you lied to him, you reading www.ukansha.com, then he will never see you again. Degree Karp pulled his fingers out of his nostrils and made the sound of opening a champagne bottle. Karp frowned and said, this is troublesome, it seems that I have to ask Sora to agree. As Karp said, he also walked out the door, came to Marshal Sora's office, walked in without the slightest courtesy, and sat on the sofa. Garp looked at Marshal Cyborg Kong, and his close friend, Admiral Sengoku, who came to talk. He waved his hands and said, you guys do yours first. Gangu Kong and Sengoku are now talking about something with a very high level of confidentiality. The two looked at each other and did not continue the conversation. Gangu Kong folded his hands to his chest, looked at Garp, and said, Karp, you'd better interrupt my conversation with Sengoku because of something important. Sengoku also looked at Garp. Garp nodded and said, yes, I have a daughter. Ha 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 asterisk 2 Gangu Kong and Sengoku were silent for a while, then they clapped their legs in tacit understanding and laughed loudly. The two, who have always been quite serious, were directly amused by Garp's words. For a long time, Gangu Kong touched the corners of his eyes, rubbed his cheeks with a stiff smile, and said to Garp, well, no matter why you interrupted my conversation with warring states, I forgive you. Now, tell me, what's the matter? Garp stared at the copper bell's big eyes and said solemnly, I'm serious, I have a daughter. Ha 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 I'm sorry ha ha ha, Garp, I really can't take it anymore ha ha ha.